I still remember the day the envelope arrived, crisp and gold-trimmed, like it had been made to scream wealth. My name, Addison Marie Gray, was printed in an elegant script that seemed almost ironic on paper, that probably cost more than my entire weekly grocery bill. When I picked it up from the mailbox, my hands shook, not with excitement, but with a strange heaviness, like a warning whispered straight from my past. I already knew whose handwriting lingered faintly on the RSVP card, the same flourished penmanship that had always scrawled notes of superiority across my childhood. Clara's. My cousin, the girl who had never let me forget that her life was glitter, while mine was dust. I should have tossed it away, saved myself the pain of walking into their world again, but I didn't. I stared at that invitation like it was a dare, and for reasons I still don't fully understand, I accepted it. Clara and I had been born only 11 months apart, raised almost like sisters, but worlds apart in the eyes of everyone else. Where she had golden hair that always seemed to fall perfectly, I had plain brown hair that frizzed no matter how much I brushed it. Where she had new dresses every holiday, mine were carefully pressed hand-me-downs that smelled faintly of mothballs. At family gatherings, she was introduced as our rising star, while I was the one they affectionately dismissed as the quiet one. They never meant affection. They meant invisible. I wasn't jealous of her beauty or her wealth, not really. What gnawed at me most was how my mother, Evelyn, would shrink under her sister Margaret's glare every time Clara sparkled in the spotlight. The invitation was proof that even after all these years, I was still expected to play the same part, the poor cousin who should be grateful just to breathe the same air. I told myself it was only a piece of paper, but the truth was that it carried a weight of decades of humiliation. As I opened it, the scent of expensive perfume clung to the card, as though even the paper wanted to remind me I didn't belong. "You are cordially invited," it read, "to the wedding of Clara Elizabeth Hargrove and Jonathan Pierce." Every word dripped with extravagance, with a finality that told me this wasn't just an invitation. It was a statement. Clara was cementing her perfect life, and I was being called to witness it, like a peasant summoned to a royal court. My chest tightened, a mix of shame and anger. But somewhere beneath it all, a flicker of defiance began to stir. If they wanted me there to complete the picture of her superiority, they'd get me, but not the way they imagined. When I showed the invitation to my mother, her face paled. She tried to hide it with a smile, but I caught the tremble in her lips. "Addie, you don't have to go," she whispered, her eyes darting to the floor like she was reliving every bruise Margaret's words had left on her spirit. My mother had spent her whole life in her sister's shadow, never daring to fight back. She worked 2 jobs after my father left us, sewing clothes late into the night to keep us afloat, while Margaret flaunted her husband's money like armor. "They'll just hurt you again," she said softly, but then she paused, her voice breaking. "Still, maybe it's time you showed them you've grown." I knew what she meant. She didn't want me to cower the way she always had. For the first time in my life, I realized I could carry both of us into that room, me and the girl my mother once wished she could defend. For days, I debated whether I should decline. I paced the small living room of our apartment, the one with its peeling wallpaper and creaky floorboards, holding that glittering invitation like it was a cursed relic. Part of me thought it was safer to stay away, to let them have their golden spectacle without me as the inevitable punchline. But another part, a deeper part, whispered that maybe fate had handed me this card for a reason. Clara had spent her whole life painting herself as untouchable. Maybe my presence, quiet but undeniable, could remind her that not everything in life could be staged. I didn't yet know how true that thought would become, or how the very stage she built would one day collapse beneath her. At that moment, all I knew was that I was tired of being erased. The weeks leading up to the wedding were filled with an ache I couldn't name. I tried to find a dress that wouldn't embarrass me, one that might whisper dignity without screaming desperation. I scoured thrift shops, running my fingers over sequined gowns that were too loud, too obvious, and settled on a deep blue dress that clung softly to my figure without begging for attention. It was modest, but it was mine, and when I looked in the mirror, I didn't see the poor cousin. I saw a woman who was tired of swallowing pain without a word. As I tried it on for my mother, she pressed her hand to her mouth and nodded, her eyes shimmering. "You look beautiful, Addie," she said, and for the first time in years, I almost believed it. Still, beneath every preparation lay the gnawing truth. I knew exactly how they would see me. Margaret would scan me up and down with those cold eyes that could slice flesh from bone. Clara would smile too wide, the kind of smile meant to dazzle the crowd while twisting the knife. Jonathan, the groom, would probably glance at me once and then forget I was even there. Just another background character in the perfect production of Clara's life. And yet, despite knowing all this, I couldn't bring myself to back down. Maybe I wanted to test myself. Maybe I wanted to see how much humiliation a heart could take before it decided to strike back. Or maybe, deep down, I already knew what cards I was holding, even if I hadn't admitted it to myself yet. The night before the wedding, I barely slept. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the radiator and the distant sounds of the city outside, replaying every childhood wound in my head. Clara's laughter when I spilled juice on my dress at her 10th birthday. Margaret's sneer when my mother served a homemade casserole at Thanksgiving while they boasted about imported caviar. The word poor echoing again and again, not just as a description, but as a destiny they had already written for me. I clenched my fists under the blanket and whispered to the darkness, "Not this time." I didn't know exactly what I meant yet, but it felt like a promise, one my younger self had waited decades to hear. The morning of the wedding dawned with a pale gray sky, heavy clouds that threatened rain. I took it as an omen, though I wasn't sure if it was for better or worse. My mother hugged me at the door before I left, her embrace tighter than usual, her silence saying more than any words could. As I walked toward the bus stop in my simple blue dress, holding my small purse like it was armor, I felt the world pressing in on me. I wasn't just going to a wedding. I was stepping into a battlefield I hadn't chosen, one where I was expected to lose. But something in me whispered otherwise. Something told me that for once, I wouldn't just endure. For once, I would decide how the story ended. As the bus rattled toward the grand estate where Clara's wedding would be held, I couldn't keep my mind from spiraling back into the past. Every bump on the road seemed to jolt free another memory I had tried so hard to bury. Childhood was supposed to be a place of comfort, but mine had been a stage where Clara always performed as the star while I played the clumsy extra. I remembered birthday parties where she unwrapped gifts piled so high they formed a small mountain, while I sat with a single doll my mother had sewn from scraps of fabric. Margaret would lean down to whisper loudly enough for everyone to hear, "It's the thought that counts." And poor Evelyn is full of thoughts, isn't she? Laughter followed like thunder, and I shrank smaller each time. School should have been a refuge, but Clara made sure it wasn't. We attended the same elementary, and she treated the playground like her kingdom. Once I wore a secondhand dress that was slightly too big for me, and before the day ended, Clara had gathered a circle of children chanting, "Addie wears curtains. Addie wears curtains." My cheeks burned as I pretended not to care, but that night, I cried into my pillow so hard that the fabric grew damp with salt. My mother tried to tell me I was stronger than their words, but even her arms around me couldn't erase the truth. Clara's cruelty was designed to stick, and it did. Every cruel word was a scar I carried, long after the bruises of childhood faded. There was also the Thanksgiving incident, one that etched itself into my memory so sharply, I could still smell the roasted turkey decades later. My mother had worked for days preparing a meal, determined to show her worth, her hands raw from peeling potatoes and scrubbing pans. Margaret arrived in a fur coat, diamonds glittering on her neck, carrying a smug smile that could slice the air. When the food was served, Clara wrinkled her nose and whispered just loud enough for the table to hear, "Why does everything taste cheap?" The silence that followed was worse than the words, broken only by Margaret's tinkling laugh as she sipped her wine. My mother's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, and that night, I swore I would never forget the sound of her silent defeat. What haunted me most weren't the big humiliations, but the small ones that bled me slowly. The way Clara always made sure I was just out of the family photos that mattered. The way Margaret introduced me to guests not as Addison, but as Evelyn's girl, the one who helps out sometimes. The way Jonathan, yes, the same Jonathan she was marrying now, once looked past me at a school dance like I didn't even exist. It wasn't hate that fueled me as much as it was erasure. Being invisible, being made to feel like even your existence was a burden. It carves deeper wounds than insults ever could, and each wound left behind a shadow I carried with me into adulthood. By the time I was 15, I had learned the art of silence. I avoided family events when I could, feigning sickness, hiding in my room, or volunteering to babysit for neighbors just to have an excuse. My mother begged me to attend sometimes, fearing Margaret's wrath if we weren't present, but she never forced me. She knew better than anyone what it cost. Still, Every absence became another weapon for Margaret and Clara. Poor Addie, too shy for company, they'd say with a pity that dripped poison. My silence, though protective, became its own cage. The less I spoke, the more they defined me, and the more I began to believe their definitions were true. I often wonder what Clara gained from it all. Maybe it wasn't enough for her to shine. She needed someone to cast shadows upon. And I, by accident of birth, had been chosen as the backdrop against which her brilliance was displayed. Margaret fueled it, of course. She treated Clara like a trophy, the crown jewel of her existence, and anything that might dull that shine had to be trampled underfoot. My mother was too weary from life to fight back, and so we became the foil, the contrast that made their gold gleam brighter. It was never just about cruelty. It was about power. They needed us weak so they could feel strong. That realization would stay with me, shaping the person I was about to become. Yet, despite the years of humiliation, I never truly hated Clara. That might sound strange, but hatred is heavy, and I was already carrying too much weight. What I felt was sharper, more complicated, a bitter mix of envy, sorrow, and quiet rage. Part of me longed for her approval, even though I knew it was poison. Another part wanted to rip away her mask, to show the world that her perfection was built on the backs of those she crushed beneath her heel. And then there was the smallest part, the one that whispered in the dead of night. Maybe one day, Addie, you'll rise, and they'll have no choice but to see you. That whisper kept me alive when the world tried to erase me. As the bus drew closer to the estate, the weight of those memories pressed harder on my chest. Every laugh, every sneer, every whispered word felt like it was stitched into the seams of my blue dress. I clenched the invitation in my hand, crumpling its perfect gold edges, and breathed deeply. I wasn't that child anymore. I wasn't the girl who cried herself to sleep while Clara danced in gowns under chandeliers. I was a woman now, and though I didn't yet know what kind of power I held, I knew one thing with certainty. I was done being their shadow. What I didn't realize then was that this wedding would give me the stage I had always been denied, and when the lights turned, it would no longer be Clara they saw. The estate loomed ahead like something out of a dream, or a nightmare. Tall iron gates swung open with a slow groan, and the bus rolled through as though even it knew it didn't belong. Beyond, a sprawling garden glittered with fairy lights strung like constellations between ancient oaks. Marble fountains spilled crystal water into pools that reflected the stars, and the mansion at the center gleamed white and gold, as if dipped in sunlight. My breath caught, not from awe, but from the sharp stab of recognition. Clara had built her fairy tale, and she wanted the world to see it. I tightened my grip on the strap of my worn purse, acutely aware of the contrast between my plain dress and the sea of gowns I glimpsed through the glowing windows. The first thing I noticed stepping off the bus was the sound, music floating like perfume through the air. A string quartet played something delicate and expensive, the kind of melody that seemed designed to remind you of your own inadequacy if you weren't born into its world. I followed the flow of guests toward the entrance, their jewelry catching the light like tiny suns. Everywhere I looked, people were dressed in fabrics that whispered wealth with every step. I clutched my invitation tighter, its gold foil mocking me now. It was supposed to be proof that I belonged here, but the weight in my chest told me it was merely permission to enter as an outsider. Inside, the ballroom was an ocean of elegance. Crystal chandeliers cascaded from the ceiling, scattering rainbows across polished floors. The scent of roses and vanilla filled the air, heavy enough to suffocate. Round tables gleamed with silver cutlery and tall candles, their flames flickering like tiny guardians of perfection. At the far end, the head table stood elevated, a stage for Clara and Jonathan, draped in ivory silk as if touched by heaven itself. And then there was Clara, radiant, of course. Her gown shimmered with beads that caught every light, her hair falling in waves like spun gold. She looked every bit the princess her mother had groomed her to be. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. She was both the dream and the dagger of my life. I hadn't made it 3 steps into the ballroom before the first wound was delivered. Margaret spotted me, her lips curving into the same smile that had haunted me since childhood. She swept toward me in a gown of deep emerald velvet, dripping in pearls, and leaned close enough that her perfume stung my eyes. "Addison," she cooed, though the word dripped acid. "How brave of you to come. I wasn't sure you'd dare, considering." Her gaze swept down my dress, pausing at my shoes, plain black flats, scuffed from use. She didn't need to finish her sentence. The sneer in her tone said it all. Considering what you are. Around us, heads turned, curious. I felt heat crawl up my neck, but I forced myself to smile tightly. It's Clara's day, I said softly. I wouldn't miss it. But Margaret wasn't done. She gestured toward the seating chart with a perfectly manicured hand. Of course we wouldn't want you uncomfortable, dear. You'll find your place in the back. We thought it best, considering optics. Optics. The word slashed at me like glass. I followed her hand, and sure enough, my name was scrawled in delicate script at a table near the kitchen doors, tucked so far away it was practically in exile. The head table shone under the chandeliers like the sun itself, while my seat languished in the shadows. I wanted to argue, to demand why blood ties meant so little when stacked against appearances, but my throat closed, and I simply nodded, walking toward my assigned place with steps that felt heavier than lead. At the back table, I sat among people I barely recognized, distant cousins, an elderly uncle dozing already, a woman whose perfume was so strong it made my eyes water. No one looked at me. No one asked who I was. I was invisible, exactly how they wanted me. From across the room, Clara laughed, her voice a chiming bell above the music. I watched her lean into Jonathan, glowing, adored, untouchable. The sight should have broken me, and for a moment, it nearly did. My hands clenched in my lap until my nails bit into my skin, leaving tiny crescents. They had caged me at the edges of their perfection, and I was supposed to stay quiet, a shadow once again. But deep inside, something stirred, a quiet rumble, the beginning of a storm. When the first course arrived, the humiliation continued. Waiters glided between tables with trays of delicacies, truffled soup, delicate pastries, wine poured into crystal glasses. But when they reached ours, the service slowed, faltered. Plates came late, wine glasses remained empty, and when I finally received a bowl of soup, it was lukewarm. I glanced toward the head table, where laughter echoed as golden champagne overflowed into flutes. My table mates shrugged as if it were expected. I realized then this wasn't an accident. Margaret's influence was woven into every thread of the evening. Even the waiters, perhaps instructed to prioritize appearances, treated us like afterthoughts. I swallowed the bitter broth, but with each sip, I felt my resolve harden. They wanted to remind me of my place, but they had no idea how much power I actually held. I lifted my eyes again, and this time, Clara met my gaze across the room. For a fleeting second, her smile faltered. Did she recognize me in that moment? Did she see the cousin she had erased, sitting in shadows but not broken? Or was it just my imagination, a desperate longing for acknowledgement? Whatever it was, it passed quickly. She turned back to Jonathan, tossing her hair like the queen she believed herself to be. Yet something shifted inside me then. For years, I had lived under the weight of invisibility. But tonight, in this glittering cage they had built, I realized I had the key. They thought I was powerless. They thought I was irrelevant. They didn't know that the very foundation of their fairy tale rested in hands they had dismissed as unworthy. Mine. The music swelled, guests raised glasses, and Margaret stood to toast her daughter, her voice booming with pride. I watched from the shadows, the forgotten cousin, the poor relative hidden at the back, but my heart beat with a steady rhythm that felt louder than the orchestra. They had written my role in this story, a background character meant to fade into obscurity, but what they didn't know was that I had already begun rewriting the script, and soon, so very soon, the lights would dim, the music would falter, and this perfect wedding would become the stage for my revenge. I tried to focus on the ceremony, but the weight of my exile pressed against my chest like a stone. From the back of the hall, the altar looked almost like a stage set in a theater. Clara glowing in white, Jonathan beaming beside her, and the efficient droning words of love and eternity. Guests leaned forward, rapt with admiration, while I sat hidden in shadows, my view blocked by the towering centerpiece of my table. It was as if the universe itself had decided I didn't deserve to see. I listened instead, piecing the ceremony together through echoes, every vow another needle stitching the fabric of their perfection. And all the while, Margaret's words whispered in my head, "Don't sit at the front. You're just the poor relative." I thought back to when Clara and I were children, chasing fireflies in my grandmother's yard. We had been equals then, or at least I had believed so. She used to hold my hand and say we'd always be sisters, even if only by blood and not by choice. But time had polished her like a jewel, and left me behind like dust. She was groomed for this life of chandeliers and silk, while I grew accustomed to patched clothes and bus rides that smelled of gasoline. Watching her now, radiant beneath the lights, I wondered if she even remembered those nights of fireflies, or if, for her, I had always been destined to serve as the shadow that made her shine brighter. The vows ended, and the applause erupted like thunder. Guests rose to their feet, cheering, crying, snapping photographs with phones studded in gold cases. I rose too, more out of habit than celebration, clapping quietly, my hands trembling. Clara and Jonathan kissed, and the room melted in delight. Champagne glasses sparkled, violins soared, and the bride's smile widened until it seemed to devour the world. I forced myself to smile as well, though my lips trembled, not out of joy, but to hide the storm swirling inside me, because beneath their cheers, I heard something else, something no one else could, the faint ticking of a clock that counted down to the moment they would remember me. Dinner began with fanfare, waiters gliding through the room in crisp uniforms. At the head table, towers of lobster, caviar, and sparkling wine appeared as though conjured by magic. At mine, service arrived late again, the portions smaller, the flavors duller. My soup was cold, my salad wilted, and my glass of water refilled only when I waved twice. Every neglect stung more than the last. I caught Margaret's gaze once across the room, her lips curving with satisfaction, as she noticed me pushing limp lettuce around my plate. She thought this was enough to break me, but the truth was, every insult fed the fire smoldering in my chest, a fire they had no idea I was capable of unleashing. When the speeches began, I braced myself. Jonathan's best man spoke first, a polished tale of friendship and admiration. Then came Margaret, her voice rich and commanding, dripping with false warmth. "Clara has always been destined for greatness," she declared, raising her glass high. "And tonight, we see her bloom into the life she deserves, surrounded by love, by family, by those who truly belong." The word belong pierced me sharper than any blade. Around me, heads nodded, glasses clinked. I felt my throat tighten, but I forced the bitterness down like bile. They thought I was powerless, a forgotten cousin hidden in shadows. What none of them knew was that I was the one who had made this wedding possible in the first place. I remembered the day the venue manager had called me, his voice anxious but polite. Clara's deposit hadn't cleared, something about banking delays, and the contract risked being voided. Desperate, Margaret had contacted me, asking if I could step in temporarily. "Just a formality," she'd said, dismissive, as though it were beneath her to care. I had signed the paperwork, transferred a small portion from the inheritance my grandmother had left me, the last gift she had managed to keep out of Margaret's greedy hands. To them, it had been a trivial favor, one they assumed I would forget, but I hadn't forgotten. The contract bore my name. The venue for this night was legally mine. I hadn't planned to use it. At first, I only wanted to attend quietly, to see Clara's happiness even if it excluded me. But as the insults piled higher, as Margaret's sneers carved deeper, I realized this wasn't just about me. This was about every time they had reduced me to less than human, every memory of being excluded, mocked, dismissed. They had built their dream castle, but they had built it on my foundation, and I was the one holding the match. The thought made my hands tremble with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. I wasn't sure if I wanted to burn it all down, or if I had already decided I would. The music swelled again, the dance floor filling with swirling gowns and flashing smiles. Clara spun in Jonathan's arms, her gown catching the light like fire. Applause followed her every move, admiration cascading like rain. I sat in silence, watching, my pulse thrumming against my skin. Somewhere deep inside, the decision solidified. They thought I was invisible. They thought I was powerless. But tonight, I would remind them that shadows can swallow light, and silence can roar louder than 1,000 cheers. The music dimmed for a moment as the master of ceremonies invited everyone to take their seats for the main course. Plates clattered, silver lids lifted, and steam rose from polished dishes. At my table, the waiters delayed again, arriving last, as though they had forgotten us completely. A guest beside me laughed. "Perks of being in the back row, huh?" I forced a smile, my jaw tight. They didn't know what I knew, didn't see the truth buried under the glitter. Every neglected refill, every late plate, every pointed glance. They weren't accidents. They were warnings, reminders of my place in their world. But what they failed to realize was that their world was balanced on a string I could snap with a single word. I slipped away from the table during the commotion of the courses being served. Nobody noticed. Why would they? Shadows vanish without sound, and that was what I had been trained to be all my life. The hallway beyond the ballroom was cooler, dimly lit, the marble echoing under my steps. I pulled out my phone, hesitated, then scrolled to the manager's number. His name, Elias, glowed on the screen, a reminder of the hushed conversation we'd had weeks ago. "Everything is under your name until full payment clears," he had told me. "Technically, you're the client of record." My thumb hovered above the call button, my heart pounding like a drum. I could end this night with a sentence, but I wasn't ready. At least, not yet. I returned quietly, blending into the background as champagne was poured for a toast. Clara laughed at something Jonathan whispered in her ear, her head thrown back in careless joy. For a moment I faltered. Was it jealousy I felt? Or grief? Maybe both. She looked untouchable, radiant in a way that made me remember the little girl who once promised we'd be inseparable. But now she barely glanced in my direction, as though I were just another servant passing through. That absence of recognition hurt more than Margaret's venomous words. My cousin had erased me, and perhaps that was the deepest betrayal of all. My hand curled around the edge of the table, nails digging into the cloth until the fabric puckered. The speeches resumed, one after another, each guest praising Clara's beauty, Jonathan's success, their destined love story. With every compliment, I felt the noose tighten around my chest. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think beyond the pounding of my own blood in my ears. My glass trembled in my hand as I lifted it mechanically with the rest, swallowing the bitter taste of wine that had long since gone warm. Nobody asked me to speak, of course. Nobody even looked my way. They didn't want my words staining their perfection. But perhaps, I thought with a small, dangerous thrill, they would hear my voice in a different way before the night was through. I excused myself once more, this time stepping into the staff corridor that led to the kitchen. The smell of garlic, butter, and roasting meat hit me instantly, stronger here than in the polished ballroom. Staff darted past, arms full of trays, too busy to question my presence. I caught sight of Elias at the far end, his suit a little less pristine than it had been at the start of the evening. I approached him, my voice calm, but edged with steel. "Elias," I said softly, "do you remember who signed your contract?" His eyes flickered with recognition, and then with unease. "Yes, of course, Ms. Addison," he replied quickly. That was all I needed. Proof that my power wasn't just imagined. It was real, tangible, waiting for me to claim it. I returned to my table calmer, though the fire inside me only burned brighter. It was like holding a match between my fingers, the flame small but lethal, its potential vast. The guests laughed louder, drank deeper, oblivious to the shifting tide. I watched Clara twirl in her gown as Jonathan lifted her hand for their first dance, the applause rising like a wave. I realized then that my revenge wouldn't just be punishment. It would be revelation. It would show them that the foundation they stood on wasn't theirs. It was mine. And when I pulled it away, they would tumble, no matter how gilded their crowns. The first dance began, the music swelling, the spotlight catching the sequins of Clara's dress. She glowed under it, flawless, adored, untouchable. And yet, in the shadows at the edge of the floor, I stood clutching a secret that could ruin everything. My eyes never left her as she spun, as laughter rippled through the room, as the violinists played faster. I wasn't sure if I was about to destroy her world for her cruelty, or for forgetting me entirely. Perhaps it didn't matter. What mattered was that the match trembled in my hand, and I was closer than ever to striking it. And so I waited, poised on the edge of a decision. The room was alive with celebration, the chandeliers gleaming, the air thick with champagne and perfume. But beneath it all, I could feel the fragility, the fault lines they couldn't see. They thought this night was carved in marble, unbreakable, eternal. What they didn't know was that everything, every song, every light, every sip of wine, was mine to take away. I pressed my hands together, steadying the fire in my veins. The time hadn't come yet, but soon, very soon. I stepped back into the hallway, my fingers trembling as I clutched the phone. The sounds of celebration muffled behind the heavy ballroom doors, but I could still hear the echo of music and laughter, taunting me with their arrogance. I scrolled to Elias's number again, my pulse hammering in my throat. For a moment, I thought of walking away, of enduring the night, leaving in silence, and never looking back. But Margaret's voice returned to me, sharp as glass. "Don't sit at the front. You're just the poor relative." The memory struck harder than any slap, and with it came a sudden clarity. I couldn't leave this untouched. Not anymore. The call connected after 2 rings, and Elias's voice came low and tired, though instantly polite. "Ms. Addison, is everything all right?" I closed my eyes, steadying myself against the wall. "I want you to stop the next course from being served," I said, my voice quieter than I expected. "Delay everything. Say there's a problem in the kitchen. I want the service disrupted." A pause, then his nervous reply. "That will create quite a scene." I almost smiled, a small, bitter curl of my lips. "Exactly," I whispered. "Let them feel, for a moment, what it's like when everything doesn't go perfectly their way." There was silence on the line, then a sigh. "You're the client of record," Elias admitted finally. "Technically, I must comply." The weight of those words sank into me like lead, but also like liberation. I must comply. No one in that room had ever bowed to me, not once. But here, now, the balance was shifting. "Good," I said, my voice steadier. "Make it happen, and don't let them trace it back to me. Not yet." I ended the call before he could protest further, sliding the phone back into my clutch. My reflection in the gilt mirror nearby startled me, my face pale, eyes darker, sharper. I didn't look like the cousin they dismissed. I looked like someone dangerous. When I returned to the ballroom, the atmosphere was still lively, laughter ringing, glasses clinking. Clara and Jonathan had finished their dance and were mingling from table to table, glowing with the warmth of admiration. I slipped back into my chair, unnoticed, my heart racing with anticipation. Then slowly, the shift began. Waiters who had been poised to serve hesitated at the doors. The clatter of dishes stopped. Conversations paused as guests noticed their plates remained empty, wine glasses unfilled. Confusion rippled across the room, subtle at first, like a draft under a locked door, and I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, watching the cracks begin to form. At the head table, Margaret frowned, waving impatiently at a server. Her sharp gestures cut the air like knives. I could almost hear her voice, though I was too far away, demanding, belittling, certain the world owed her immediate obedience. But this time, there was no immediate response. The waiters avoided her eyes, shuffling uncomfortably, pretending to be busier than they were. I felt the tension tighten like a rope around the room. Every guest was too polite to complain, but their smiles grew thinner, their voices lower. What had been seamless now stuttered, faltered. The illusion of control was slipping. Clara noticed next. She leaned toward Jonathan, whispering something with a nervous smile, her hand brushing her gown as though smoothing invisible wrinkles. He nodded, trying to reassure her, but I could see the unease creeping into his eyes. It was subtle, but unmistakable, the first flicker of fear that something wasn't perfect. I drank it in, that tiny fracture, sweeter than the champagne in my glass. They didn't know yet that the fracture would spread, that I would widen it until it shattered. But I knew, and in that knowledge, I found power I had never felt before. The murmurs grew louder. A man at the next table asked when the next course would arrive, and the waiter stammered an excuse about a delay in the kitchen. His wife frowned, tapping her nails against the tablecloth. Margaret stood suddenly, her voice sharp and cutting across the room, demanding an explanation. The room fell briefly silent, her authority filling the space the way it always had. But this time, it didn't silence me. I sat with my wineglass in hand, the taste of victory faint but undeniable on my tongue. For once, Margaret's control was slipping, and I was the one pulling the strings. And yet, beneath the thrill, something heavier stirred inside me. As I watched Clara's smile falter, her eyes dart nervously toward her guests, a pang struck deep in my chest. Was I punishing her for her mother's cruelty, for her own indifference? Or was I punishing both of us, for the years we'd lost, for the promises we'd broken? The line blurred as my vision burned with unshed tears. Revenge was intoxicating, yes, but it was also poison, seeping through me as I fed it. Still, I clenched my hands tighter, steadying myself. This was only the beginning. One thread had been pulled, and the tapestry was unraveling. There was no turning back. The whispers had grown louder, threads of doubt weaving between tables like smoke. The ballroom, once a symphony of laughter and music, had become a discordant hum of unease. I felt it under my skin, That shift in atmosphere, the way perfection slipped through Margaret's fingers like sand. She snapped at another waiter, her tone slicing the silence, but still no food arrived. Elias had followed through exactly as I'd asked. I pressed my palm against my knee to keep from trembling, part exhilaration, part fear. The power was heady, but it came with a weight I had never carried before. Jonathan tried to mask the discomfort, raising his glass to toast Clara, his voice booming with forced cheer, but the clinking of glasses was scattered, half-hearted. Too many guests glanced toward the door, toward the empty trays that should have been circulating. Even the music faltered, the band hesitating before striking up another tune. Clara's smile wavered as she tugged at Jonathan's sleeve, whispering something urgent. He nodded, squeezing her hand, but the shine in his eyes had dulled. I knew that look. He was calculating, worried about appearances, about how much their perfect image could withstand before it cracked. I leaned back in my chair, invisible among them, just as I had been all my life. Only now, I wasn't powerless. My invisibility was armor. It let me see clearly what they couldn't, how quickly admiration could sour into judgment. The guests exchanged sidelong glances, lips tight with impatience, eyebrows arched in irritation. Some checked their watches, others whispered about leaving early. I imagined the whispers mutating, spreading like wildfire. The wedding wasn't properly planned. The family had lost their grip. Margaret's daughter didn't deserve the pedestal they'd built. That image alone filled me with a dark satisfaction. Margaret, red with fury, stormed across the room and cornered the event coordinator near the stage. Though I couldn't hear every word, her gestures were violent, her fingers stabbing the air, her voice a shrill echo. The coordinator's face was pale, nodding nervously, but he didn't move, because Elias had his orders, because for the first time, Margaret's demands were not law. I watched her spin back toward the tables, plastering a smile so tight it looked like pain. "Just a small delay," she announced. "Everything will resume shortly." Her voice rang out, confident, but her eyes flickered with panic. She was losing control. Clara stood beside her, her gown shimmering under the lights, though her expression betrayed her unease. She bit her lip, glancing around the room as if begging for reassurance, but none came. The eyes on her were no longer adoring. They were assessing, calculating. Guests smiled thinly, but shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Even her bridesmaids looked uncertain, whispering among themselves instead of fawning at her side. For the first time all evening, Clara looked small, fragile, like a porcelain figure balanced on the edge of a table, beautiful, but one touch away from shattering. I felt the sting of tears behind my eyes as I watched her. My cousin, the girl who once braided my hair by the lake, who once swore she'd never forget me, was now crumbling under the weight of her mother's ambitions. Part of me wanted to rise, to take her hand, to tell her it would be all right, but the sharper, harder part of me silenced that impulse. She stood by Margaret. She let them treat me like nothing. She chose silence when I needed her voice. My chest ached with the contradiction, torn between vengeance and the ghost of the bond we once shared. A commotion drew my attention as one of the older uncles rose abruptly, muttering about the service being disgraceful. His wife tried to hush him, but the words had already spilled into the air, heavy with disdain. More guests shifted, restless, their murmurs no longer discreet. The tension that had been simmering now bubbled into visibility, raw and uncontained. Clara's cheeks burned crimson, and Jonathan's jaw tightened as he whispered something that made her flinch. The fairy tale facade was fracturing under the weight of real human impatience and disappointment. It was happening faster than I had dared hope. I closed my eyes for a moment, drawing a slow, steady breath. This was the crack I had waited for, the place where the glass was weakest. I had started it with a whisper, a delay, a single pulled thread. Now the fabric of the evening was unraveling, and the mighty Margaret could do nothing to sew it back together. Still, the question clawed at the back of my mind, sharper with every heartbeat. Would I stop here, letting them drown in embarrassment, or would I push harder, until the whole wedding collapsed, leaving nothing but ashes? My fingers curled around the stem of my glass. I already knew the answer. I leaned forward, letting the stem of the glass rest against my lips, savoring the taste of my decision. There would be no retreat. This was no longer about one cruel remark, or a single humiliation at a dinner table. This was years of being dismissed, ignored, shoved into corners while Margaret and Clara paraded themselves as untouchable. If I stopped now, they'd recover, polish the cracks, and rewrite tonight as nothing but a minor inconvenience. No, I wanted the kind of collapse that couldn't be smoothed over with charm. I wanted them to taste powerlessness, the way they had forced it on me all my life. Elias appeared near the side of the hall, his eyes catching mine for a brief second before flicking away. The signal was subtle, invisible to everyone else, but it told me he was ready. I shifted slightly in my chair, straightening my back, and gave the smallest nod. Moments later, the lights above flickered. At first, it seemed like a mere technical glitch, a hiccup in the grand machinery of the evening. But then, the chandeliers dimmed further, leaving the room bathed in shadows. The musicians faltered mid-song, the violins screeching awkwardly before trailing into silence. A wave of unease rolled through the crowd, restless and thick. Margaret's shrill voice cut through the darkness. "Someone fix this immediately," she barked, her heels clicking furiously as she marched toward the stage. But no one moved. The staff had been warned, the cords already pulled, the orders already given. For the first time in years, Margaret's authority met resistance, and she didn't know what to do with it. Her face twisted with confusion, panic leaking into her voice as she repeated her demand. The silence of the staff was louder than any rebellion. The audience watched, their murmurs sharpening, curiosity turning into doubt. Clara clutched Jonathan's arm, her knuckles white against his sleeve. He whispered something sharp in her ear, his jaw tight, and she shook her head desperately. I couldn't hear their words, but the scene was clear enough. He was blaming her, or perhaps her family, for the unraveling of the evening. His carefully constructed image as the perfect groom was cracking alongside the wedding. Clara's eyes glistened as she glanced at the restless crowd. In those eyes, I recognized the child she used to be, the one who used to cry when she felt abandoned, who once leaned on me for comfort. But now, she had no one to lean on. The whispers rose into arguments. Some guests were standing now, demanding answers. The hunger, the darkened room, the absence of control, it all fermented into impatience and ridicule. Laughter, sharp and cruel, erupted from a group of younger cousins near the back. "What kind of wedding is this?" one said loudly, not bothering to hide the disdain. Others nodded, muttering about wasted time and poor planning. The judgment that Margaret had so mercilessly inflicted on others was now being served to her, multiplied, unforgiving. And still, she flailed, powerless to stop it. I felt my heart pound as I stood, unnoticed at first, my chair scraping softly against the marble floor. For once, the invisibility cloak I had worn all my life was slipping away. I stepped forward slowly, weaving between tables, my eyes locked on Margaret and Clara at the front. No one saw me as a threat. They barely saw me at all. That was the beauty of it. By the time their eyes landed on me, by the time they realized I was walking with purpose, it would already be too late. I had lived my entire life in their shadows, and now I would drag them into mine. Elias, bless him, had timed it perfectly. Just as I reached the edge of the dance floor, the remaining lights cut out completely. The chandeliers went black, the stage dimmed, even the emergency sconces along the walls stayed unlit. Gasps filled the room as darkness swallowed us whole. For a heartbeat, there was only silence, heavy, suffocating, absolute. And then the room erupted with voices, shouting, cursing, laughing nervously. The chaos I had envisioned was alive, tangible, wrapping around every guest like a storm. In the darkness, no one was glamorous anymore. No one was admired. They were just frightened people in expensive clothes, powerless. I stood in that thick darkness, my chest rising and falling as if I had just climbed a mountain. And maybe I had. For years I had carried their cruelty like a weight chained to my ribs, dragging me down, silencing me. But here I was, standing tall in the very heart of their empire, and I had set it ablaze with nothing more than whispers and patience. My breath trembled with exhilaration and fear, because I knew there was no turning back now. The collapse had begun, and all I had to do was push one final time to make sure they would never recover. The dark swallowed the hall whole, a velvet curtain that turned beauty into fear. I could hear shoes scraping, chairs toppling, gasps colliding with nervous laughter. Somewhere to my left, glass shattered, followed by a shriek. But above the noise, Margaret's voice rose like a whip. "Do not panic. This is nothing. They'll fix it in a moment." Her tone cracked, the authority thinning as uncertainty gnawed at her. For the first time, she didn't sound invincible. She sounded like everyone else, scared and desperate, and the crowd heard it too. I stayed still for a moment, letting the chaos bloom unchecked. This was the theater I had built, and now the actors were improvising in terror. Jonathan tried to calm Clara, his hand gripping her shoulder tightly, but she was shaking, her carefully painted face streaked with sweat and tears. A few brave guests shouted for someone to call the manager. Others stumbled toward the exits, only to find them locked. Another quiet instruction Elias had executed with precision. A wedding meant to symbolize perfection had now become a cage, and in that cage, reputations were crumbling. I walked forward, slowly, the sound of my steps deliberate against the marble. "What's happening?" Clara's voice broke, rising over the murmurs. "Why isn't anyone fixing this?" I stopped near the front, just where the last faint glow of dying candles kissed my face. Margaret spotted me and stiffened, her eyes narrowing as if she suddenly recognized a predator she hadn't seen before. For once, she had no sneer ready, no weapon in her tongue, just confusion and the faint beginnings of dread. With a calmness that surprised even me, I spoke. "It's simple. The venue isn't broken. It's canceled." The words dropped into the crowd like stones into water, rippling outward, colliding with ears that strained for answers. Murmurs turned into shouts. "Canceled?" someone echoed. Jonathan's mouth fell open, then snapped shut, rage twisting his face. Clara blinked at me, stunned, her lips trembling, and Margaret, dear Margaret, looked as if she had been slapped in front of everyone she once ruled. For the first time, silence fell in patches as guests strained to understand what I meant. I turned, slow and deliberate, sweeping my eyes across the room. Every light, every dish, every glass of wine, it was under one name, mine, Addison Ward. "You wanted the perfect palace for your perfect wedding, Clara, but perfection has a price Margaret thought I could never afford." She forgot that poverty is not permanent. She forgot that scars make people resourceful. The words trembled with fire as I let them spill, each syllable tearing through years of silence. The weight that had sat on my chest for so long was lifting. I was finally heard. Margaret lunged forward, her face twisted with fury. "You miserable little liar. This is some stunt." But even her voice cracked under the disbelief etched into the guests' faces. They weren't siding with her. They were watching her unravel. Her authority was collapsing in real time. Clara shook her head violently, whispering, "No, no, no," as if the repetition might reverse what she was hearing. Jonathan's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching as he looked at his bride, his eyes dark with blame. He saw his social investment bleeding out in front of him. I straightened, my voice slicing through the room. "You told me not to sit at the front because I was just the poor relative. Do you remember that, Margaret?" Gasps spread through the crowd, faces turning toward her, whispers hissing like snakes. "You sneered at me. You treated me like a blemish at your grand parade, but tonight was never yours to control. You've lived your life pushing people like me into the shadows. Well, here I am, in the center of the light you built, and I've shut it off." Each word landed like a hammer against glass, shattering the last illusions of their untouchable image. The room erupted. Some guests laughed nervously, clapping as though it were theater. Others muttered in disgust, glaring at Clara and Margaret as if they were frauds exposed. The spell of admiration had broken, and nothing Margaret shouted could reweave it. Clara crumbled, her hands covering her face as sobs slipped through her fingers. Jonathan pulled away from her, his expression cold, his body stiff as a man watching his carefully chosen life dissolve. And I stood there, no longer small, no longer invisible. I was the architect of their ruin, and they finally knew it. The ballroom had turned into chaos, the perfect illusion shattered beyond repair. Guests whispered and pointed, some laughing nervously, others clutching their drinks as if holding on to dignity itself. Margaret's face was a mask of fury and disbelief. Her usual composure evaporated like morning mist. Clara's gown, once radiant, seemed heavy with shame, dragging her down into the chaos that I had orchestrated. Jonathan's hands clenched into fists at his sides, his jaw taut, as if the world had finally revealed the futility of his carefully curated life. And I, Addison, stood in the center of it all, unshaken, feeling a satisfaction that burned like fire through my veins. I had one final move left, one last reminder of who held the power. I lifted my hand, calling Elias over, and whispered a single instruction. Within moments, the lights flickered again, plunging the hall into near darkness. Emergency alarms began to hum, synchronized to a subtle signal I had arranged beforehand. Guests shrieked, some stumbling to the nearest doors, others frozen with shock. Panic rose in a wave, crashing over Margaret as she barked orders that no one obeyed. The perfect dinner, the flawless music, the illusions of wealth and control, they were gone. Every second of preparation had been undone, and the room vibrated with raw, undeniable truth. Clara's sobs broke through the din. She turned to me, eyes wide and pleading, finally seeing the cousin she had dismissed for years. "Addison, why?" she cried, her voice raw, her perfect facade destroyed. I stepped closer, my voice calm, sharp with years of restrained anger. "Because you and your mother spent my life reminding me of my place. You thought wealth, glamour, and power could erase me. But tonight, you saw that what you built wasn't yours. It was mine to command, and I chose to remind everyone exactly who holds the real power." The words echoed in the room, harsh and undeniable. Margaret's face had gone pale, her lips trembling as she realized that her control had ended, and in a way she couldn't undo. You'll regret this," she hissed, venom failing to hide fear. But it was empty. Her threats held no weight against the truth now displayed for all. Every guest had witnessed her humiliation, the exposure of the artifice behind her meticulously curated world. Her authority, painstakingly polished for decades, lay in ruins, cracked and shattered like the fine crystal she once used to dazzle others. And no apology, no demand, no wealth could restore it. I turned away, letting the storm unfold behind me, the whispers and shocked gasps my orchestra. Each glance that followed me down the aisle, each wide-eyed gasp and clutch at pearls, reinforced the power I had claimed. Clara fell against Jonathan, clutching him, shaking, while Margaret shouted futile instructions at staff who no longer obeyed. The room was a theater of disbelief, and I was the director who had never been acknowledged, the shadow who had finally stepped into the light. Every insult, every dismissal of the past, had led to this moment of absolute reckoning. I paused at the exit, looking back one final time. The chandeliers flickered above, a faint hum of electricity betraying the disruption I had set in motion. Guests were exiting in clusters, some trying to comfort Clara, others too stunned to speak. Margaret's screams faded, replaced by whispers of gossip that would follow her long after the night ended. I smiled softly, a sense of completion settling into my chest. For years I had been invisible, ignored, and underestimated. Tonight, the poor cousin became the arbiter of truth, the unseen force who finally made them see. Stepping out into the cool night air, I inhaled deeply, letting the chaos behind me recede into memory. My heart, once weighed down with resentment and invisibility, felt lighter than ever. Freedom wasn't simply leaving the ballroom. It was taking control of my own narrative, demanding acknowledgement where none had been offered. I hadn't merely disrupted a wedding. I had reshaped the story of my life, carving out a space where my voice mattered, where my presence could no longer be denied. And in that triumph, I realized that vengeance, when measured and deliberate, was more powerful than any sorrow or insult I had endured. As I walked away from the estate, heels clicking against the driveway, I glanced back once more. The scene behind the windows was a tableau of shattered illusions, a perfect wedding undone by a single, underestimated cousin. I felt no regret, only clarity and strength. The world had finally witnessed the truth. Addison Ward was no longer the shadow, no longer the poor relative. I had claimed my place in the light. And as the first whispers of the night's story began to spread into the world outside, I smiled to myself, knowing that some lessons can only be learned when pride and arrogance are brought to their knees.